It was a wet, freezing cold day when James McCormick, 16 years old at the time, disappeared on Larch Mountain in Portland, Oregon. James and his father shared the same name, so for the sake of simplicity and to avoid confusion, I'll just refer to him as James's father. At the time, they were on a hunting trip together in December of 1961, wanting to spend some time together before Christmas. James had always loved being in the outdoors from a young age, and his father was always eager to take him out there to various places. It's not clear to me if the pair had been to Larch Mountain before, but this obviously wasn't their first time on such a trip. This time would be different though, because only a day into their trip, on the 2nd of December that year, they would be blindsided by a sudden storm which forced them to desperately seek out shelter. This effort to find shelter was strenuous because at the time they were mostly out in the open, and it seems that it must have been a hard trek to find somewhere safe, because during this ordeal, James became delirious. Presumably, this was because the area was already cold to begin with, and then they were hit by a storm with heavy rains while the temperature dropped even further. The father knew that they were in trouble at this point, and he helped James along the final stretch, where they found a large old tree to shelter under, and they sat at the base with some overhead cover. There, the father tried his best to get a fire going, but each attempt failed. It was just too wet. This meant that there was no warmth to be found, and the pair was stranded and soaking wet. James's father knew that they couldn't stay there long, and they had to get out of there before they succumbed to the elements. They rested for a short while before getting back up, and then they set off to get off the mountain. Unfortunately, it seems that this might have been a misguided decision because they were already quite high in elevation, though a specific height wasn't given. The problem though was that now the rocks were slippery and that there was a biting, galing wind all around them, which in comparison to before the storm hit, they were now practically at a snail's pace. James found it hard to continue as they were being pelted and battered by the heavy rain and wind, and eventually he wasn't able to continue. His father carried him for 3 hours before something perhaps unusual happened. The father said that after carrying his son for 3 hours, he saw lights on the mountain and left his son under a tree, telling him to stay put while he went to get help. However, after going in search of these lights, he said that they vanished and that now he was scared of becoming lost and rushed back to his son. James T. McCormick, 46, Portland fire investigator, said that on Sunday night he went to investigate some lights. Afterwards, his son was gone from the place that he'd left him. The father was lost with his son from Saturday until Monday morning when he stumbled near exhaustion to the lodge. He said that his son was delirious. He had left him about 4 miles back on the trail Sunday night. A growing search force travelled wet, chilled trails on Larch Mountain, east of Portland, in a desperate hunt for James. More than 100 searchers pushed off from Multnomah Falls Lodge at dawn. Scores more were ready to go. Most of Portland's off-duty firemen were taking part in the search. Unfortunately, nothing more was ever mentioned with the incident involving the lights. Only that James went in search of the origin and followed them, but eventually lost them. When he returned to his son, he was gone. That's all we have for that aspect. This search was actually very large right from the get-go, with over 100 people involved almost immediately, and many firefighters were on their way to assist. Something else quite odd also happened during this search, but first, just for some perspective. The pair of them got lost on the 2nd and separated the following day during the incident involving the lights. The father made it to the lodge on Monday morning, meaning that James had been alone in the freezing weather for all that time in between. Given the description of his son's state, it appears that most didn't believe that he was going to be found in any great condition, and the thought was that he'd likely already passed away due to exposure. Now, on the day that the search effort began, which was Monday the 4th, One of the searchers found one of James's boots by itself with no obvious indicators of where he might have gone. This of course gave the searchers a central point of which to fan out from, and hundreds of searchers scoured this area with the use of tracking dogs. The problem was though that they weren't finding anything. They knew full well that he couldn't have been far from that point because of the delirious condition that he was in. It sounded very much like he was already well on his way to the end stages of hypothermia. Hundreds of people in this moment were not able to find James, and they searched well into the night. This search failed and then began again the following day, where they would find James's body in an area that they had already searched. The discovery of James' body Tuesday afternoon saddened scores of searchers who hunted for the boy on the rugged slopes of the Cascades above Multnomah Falls. It was Portland fireman John A. Yuskowski who spotted the body, huddled up against a log about 200 yards away from where the searchers found one of the boy's boots Monday. It was stated that James had likely passed away due to exhaustion and exposure, but there wasn't any further discussion about this. I imagine searchers were left feeling frustrated and somewhat confused too, because this particular area close by to the boot was searched over and over again. Given James's state, it was a miracle in and of itself how he was even managing to get around at this point. When you're well on your way into the various stages of hypothermia, you become very groggy, slow, weak and confused, and your movements are sluggish. It's not clear how he managed to evade over 100 people like this, but he did. Unfortunately, there are no further articles, discussions, or mentions of this disappearance after the 6th of December 1961. This was an extraordinarily unfortunate set of circumstances. What are your thoughts? Guy Heckel was an 11-year-old Boy Scout when he disappeared from a Boy Scout camp in Toddville, Iowa. At 8 PM on the 3rd of February 1973, Guy was playing a game of capture the flag with the other scouts, in which Guy himself had retrieved the flag, and afterwards you're supposed to hide with it to prevent the others from finding and recapturing it, which is what he'd done. After a while, the other boys gave up because they couldn't find him and were calling his name to come back, but they never got a response from Guy and quickly darted to the scout leaders. The first report of this incident came in 2 days after Guy had vanished during this game. The search was continuing near here today for Guy. An estimated 500 persons, along with planes and helicopters, searched an estimated 3 square miles near this eastern Iowa community Sunday for the boy. Searches were hampered by rough terrain and muddy ground. Authorities said that they don't expect foul play in the boy's disappearance. Right off the bat, despite the authorities' claim of no suspicions of foul play, people all over the camp felt that something was wrong here because, as described, the terrain there was rough and rugged and would be very difficult to try to make your way through it. Because of this, when they couldn't find Guy in the vicinity of where they played the game, they began to feel that not everything was so clear. This was probably further compounded by the fact that there were now over 500 people in the immediate area who weren't finding anything. Just to be clear also, straight after the disappearance, a search was initiated by the scout leaders which obviously failed. At this point, a whole week had passed since the initial time of disappearance, and the county sheriff said that there had been no new developments at all to speak of. There was a little bit of weirdness at this point that I wasn't expecting. The youth's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Heckel, have asked a group of Missouri clairvoyants to assist. However, organised searching was discontinued late this week after hundreds of volunteers, including a search and rescue team from California, had combed this area without success. Some of the boy's clothing and a picture of him were flown to the Physical Research and Training Center in hopes the group could locate him through extrasensory perception. Weirdly, the director of this group said that they had seen the boy in a small ravine, obscure, in the middle of a mound in a small wash, and also said that they were going to send some of their staff to the scene. So, while the traditional search came to an end, and the rescue teams, along with the volunteers, had been sent home, a team of 6 clairvoyants arrived at the camp 5 days later. The articles at this point weren't providing much information, other than stating that it was unusual that around 500 searchers were not able to locate Guy or any trace of him. It really is quite bizarre that you can have that many people in this area and not uncover anything. Guy's parents were not willing to give up yet, despite the sheriff declaring the end of the search effort, and they were very vocal about their son's disappearance. The team of clairvoyants, for whatever reason, became interested in some of the bodies of water in the area and began to dig out the ice in preparation for professional diving teams to come search them. These searches, I believe, led to the finding of Guy's jacket very close to the point of his disappearance. The search had been resumed Sunday after Robert discovered a jacket identical to one worn by Guy. The jacket was snagged on a log on the east bank of the river, across the river from the Duane Arnold Energy Center. It was near the place where Guy was last seen. Captain George Griffin, Chief Lynn Deputy, said that the finding of the jacket was the first clue to be found. Together with other facts, leads to the conclusion that Guy must have entered the water and passed away, which is now the most likely theory for his disappearance. Interestingly, Captain Griffin then goes on to state that there were a large number of searches in this area very shortly after the disappearance, stating that it made it unlikely that Guy wouldn't have been found if he was on land at the time. He also tried to explain why the jacket wasn't found initially. There is some question how the jacket would have come off the boy, but the deputy was told by a former Navy frogman that it was probable that it would if he had been swept away. Deputies said that the jacket was zipped at the bottom. They said it appeared the log on which it was snagged had been underwater at the time of the boy's disappearance, and that it came into view as the river level receded. At this point, the situation becomes more odd and unclear as to the nature of the disappearance. An official of the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation, Tuesday, will send an agent to investigate the disappearance of Guy. Extensive searches have so far failed. The BCI entry into the case came after the youth's father, Howard, wrote a letter to State Rep Raymond, who took up the matter with the BCI. Howard came across some information that until this point hadn't been shared for some bizarre reason. Apparently, some of the Boy Scouts who were at the camp at the time had seen lights around the campsite. No one knew the origin of the lights, only that they'd seen them. And apparently, lights had been seen within the camp too. Howard said Tuesday he had been told by his son's scoutmaster that someone had shined a light in the bedroom window of another boy in the troop 3 nights after Guy's disappearance. Howard said those incidents were not thoroughly checked out by local authorities. I have absolutely no idea why this information wasn't shared sooner. With the comment, those incidents were not thoroughly checked out by local authorities, that kind of implies that the local authorities must have known about it, but I'm not sure. The insinuation by the scoutmaster was that he believed someone had shone a flashlight through one of the Boy Scouts' windows. The implication now is that if someone had been lurking around the camp, whoever it was may have made themselves known to Guy, who panicked and ran off towards the river. That, of course, is speculation, and the initial investigations found no evidence of foul play. It's not even clear what the source was of these lights that had been seen around the camp. Was it some uninvited third party? Was it a member of staff at the camp? None of the above? None of these questions would ever receive an answer. It also seems like Howard disagreed with the local authorities on the finding of the jacket. The authorities' conclusion was that Guy must have fallen into the water and then it came off sometime during travel. However, Howard said the jacket was partially zipped and he could not understand how his son could have gotten out of it. Over the weeks and months after the disappearance, when the ice began to clear, divers entered the water multiple times trying to find him, but ultimately never did. There were debates and arguments as to what happened, which caused the search operation leader to say, "The unit can give a 93% assurance that Guy was not on the ground within the 12 square miles of our search area." The family would also state, "We feel there are two possible answers to Guy's disappearance. Either he did get lost and drowned in the river, or there is the remote possibility that he met with foul play and he could be anywhere." This thought, I assume, was probably based on the lights seen around the camp. The investigators also seem to think that this was a possibility, as this was stated 19 years later. There's always the possibility that Guy was taken, but we have absolutely no leads to go on in that direction. The Heckels mostly agree and believe their son probably passed away in the water, but will not rule out the possibility that he had been taken. "We can't rule that out because we never found his body in the river," said Guy's mother. Ultimately, Guy nor his body was ever found, and it's unlikely this disappearance will ever be solved conclusively. What do you think? On the 8th of May 1955, a strange incident would occur on a wooded foothill region around 14 miles southwest of McMinnville, where a 2-year-old boy, Jess Davis, disappeared from his grandfather's ranch at 10 AM that morning. Jess's parents had taken him and his 3 young sisters there for Mother's Day, where they'd planned to stay for a while. On that morning, Jess was playing in the back garden while his 3 sisters were in the front garden. The grandparents estimated that Jess must have been alone in the garden for 10 minutes before they realised that he was missing. After reaching the back garden and realising he wasn't there, they quickly called the authorities. Jess wandered away from his grandparents' home in the brush-covered foothills of the Oregon Coast Range about 10 AM Sunday. He was still missing more than 2 hours later, despite an exhaustive ground search by 100 police and volunteers and 3 bloodhounds. He was lightly clad and the early morning temperature dropped to freezing. While this incident was very odd and suspicious and screamed potential foul play, there was a confusion in the air because their grandparents' ranch was very remote, and it's not a place you would really expect to see anyone else. Coupled with that fact was that the family had not seen anyone else in the area and no vehicles present either. With that said though, the authorities did put this message out across the radio. A group of 40 men searched throughout the afternoon without finding any trace of the boy, and officials called for a radio appeal to fishermen in the area to check their cars in the event he had crawled into an automobile and fallen asleep. This message went out because after large groups of people scoured the vicinity, they couldn't find a trace of Jess and concluded that he just couldn't be in the area anymore. The reasoning seems to have been that in the space of just a couple of hours, a 2-year-old should not be able to get very far and they should have been able to locate him. Despite the fact that the family hadn't seen anyone loitering in the area or any cars, you almost have to assume that behind the scenes, the authorities must have been contemplating the idea that Jess had been taken. Now, thankfully, Jess was found 24 hours after he disappeared, and I almost stopped reporting on this case and moved on after reading this article. Jess, lost for 24 hours in the woods near here, was found alive and well yesterday. Jess told hospital attendants that he was hungry and wanted a banana. The boy, though covered with briar scratches and exhausted, was expected to recover quickly. This article didn't really give any further information and I was about to move on. However, I then came across information that perhaps this wasn't just straightforward at all. What the article failed to mention was that Jess had somehow travelled around 6 miles from the ranch. More than 100 persons had joined the search for a boy before he was found by 2 loggers who heard him crying. Sheriff's Deputy Ford Hagen said the boy had apparently walked 5 or 6 miles before being found. Somewhere between 5 and 6 miles is an impressive distance to have covered in this situation, which was unfortunately given short shrift by the authorities, and seems to have been closer to 6 miles travelled, as we'll discover in the next article, which covered it in more detail. Jess was found alive and apparently alright, but completely exhausted. 2 loggers discovered Jess about a mile from the home of his grandparents, from which he had walked off 24 hours before. It appeared that Jess had covered about 6 miles, part by road and part over hill, in a circuitous journey. The boy, lightly clad, apparently had stayed awake the entire time in temperatures that once dropped to about the freezing level. Jess was brought to hospital for treatment of exposure and possible shock. Max and Vigo, loggers who were walking through the woods in the Panther Creek area, heard Jess crying. They took him to a nearby farm to await arrival of Sheriff's Deputy Ford Hagen, who drove him back to McMinnville. Hagen said Jess was wet and muddy, as if he had been wading, and his legs were scratched from vines. Searchers were puzzled about how he got so far in the brush-covered hill country. The temperatures in the area were around 35 degrees Fahrenheit at the time, or 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and went to around freezing once during Jess's ordeal. The professional rescue teams expressed publicly that they didn't understand how Jess had managed to walk that distance by himself. And unfortunately, at least from what I could find, there were no further discussions on this, and no conclusion seems to have been drawn. Did someone take Jess initially and then change their mind? Did he wander that distance by himself? What do you think happened here? I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.